Alright guys, so in today's video we're going to be going into an article by Michael Hudson, who's an economist. This came out in March 2020 originally, and right at the beginning of the lockdowns. For me, I read this back then, and it was sort of like an anthem for the idea that there is not going to be a going back to normal in terms of economics and in finance. That's a mathematical impossibility. And so we're going to be talking about some of the ideas underlying that concept. But just to give a sort of summary and an overview, I would say that when we had the great financial crisis of 2007 through 2011, but concentrated in that 2007, 2008, 2009 period with the bailouts, and there was that critical period where we didn't know if stuff was going to get passed and everything was going to collapse and blah blah blah. The kind of engineered crisis, I suppose. It was interesting. I had just moved to DC when that all went down, and so I was in that. I've been in that climate ever since. And what that climate is a climate of nonstop bailouts. So even though the service level economy looks like it's the same as it was 15 years ago, the underlying fundamental structure of the economy has changed in radical ways and is continuously changing all the time. So really the global financial system has been in a state of transformation since this 2007-2008 period in a fundamental way. And one of the things that's happened is that all the basically the whole private system is underlied by the financial institution, and that whole system has basically been all the assets, bad assets and bad loans and debts that are held by the private institutions that they made so much money from during all the bubble years. That was all basically taken over into the public responsibility. And you've had a nonstop culture of continuous bailouts. And what that means is that the relationship between governance and finance and the private sector and the corporations, that relationship structure is really wed together now in a sort of weird way that doesn't fit any of the typical descriptions we have about capitalism or socialism or any of these things, because it's a kind of hybrid state corporate entity that is sort of interwoven with the national security state and sort of dominating all aspects of society, and people have no idea what's going on. And so Michael Hudson is one of the best at elucidating some of the underlying principles about what has happened in our financial and economic sphere. And so let's get into his article. It's called "Unpayable Corporate Debt: A Brady Bond Solution for America's Economic Crisis." All right, so he begins by saying, even before the COVID-19 crisis, financial markets were in an inherently unstable condition. Years of quantitative easing into the stock market to inflate stock and bond prices raised those prices far too high for any normal or reasonable historical standard. So he's basically saying we were already in a bubble economy going back several decades on a global level, but it's sort of fueled by the U.S. capitalist system. And that has gone into a sort of like hyper state that's fueled by this nonstop bailout policy, which is designed to keep things artificially inflated, keep the surface level economy and society looking normal. But we're having these structural changes in terms of ownership, in terms of public-private relationship, and in terms of the underlying ideas of, are we a republic, are we a democracy? We're so far outside of those concepts. We need to be thinking more in terms of like a technocracy, more in terms of a sort of oligarchical concept. So before going to the next section, I just want to point out that the fundamental dynamics that led to the 2007-2008 crisis were never resolved. And if you will rewind back to that Occupy Wall Street era, um, if you'll remember, what happened is that you had a very fragile financial system that had too much debt. It was like a bubble, right? It was ballooned with too much debt, and the debt was taken on with a lot of bad loans, and the bad loans were uh, a lot of people were involved with that, but they were certainly pushed from a central from the financial system. So you had a bunch of bad debts, and you had a big financial system that had ballooned up, and then it had gone into crisis because there was a stoppage in the payment of those debts, and because everything was so interwoven that when the debt kept, it's like a pyramid scheme, when it stopped being able to keep blowing itself up in this bubble fashion, that's when we had the emergency. And so it was a structural problem that requires structural solution. Of course, we had no structural solution, and we just had the nonstop kicking the can down the road through this quantitative easing policy. So that's where we are today. So if we consider the fact that we never fixed the problems of 15 years ago, and we've just kicked the can down the road, what we didn't deal with then must inevitably be dealt with now. And so if you can imagine how a very fragile economic system would react back then to when you have a global economy shut down and entire industries be completely destroyed, where is the giant financial crash? Where is the crisis? Obviously, something's amiss here. And so what's amiss is the fact that we no longer have the type of economic and state governance relationship that is believed by the majority of people. So people believe that things work one way, but in reality they work a very different way. So we're going to be touching just a little bit on what is so different about the reality versus the perception. So let's look at this. He says the Fed's quantitative easing since 2008, plus the dynamic of large companies using their earnings for stock buybacks, drove the prices of financial assets into a realm of unreality. That means it's a bubble economy. And the markets were already teetering on the brink of fragility. So any external shock to a system in this fragile state was going to be a disaster. It's bound to crash the artificially inflated values at which the financial markets were priced. And so the official governance policy, the Fed not being officially a part of our government, but as part of our governance. So the governance policy was to perpetuate this situation for as long as possible by pumping in yet more credit. So that was a coordinated state, national security, and financial access to make this possible, because everybody has to play their part. So this is not something that you can just blame on corporations. This is now our official governance policy. You'll note that it's not actually lawful or legal according to the Constitution. So we're in a strange state in terms of what's actually lawful and what's constitutional in those things, because we're kind of outside of the idea that people in power are respecting those documents. He notes that the reality of the situation requires that ultimately what can't be paid won't be paid. So if you have a bubble that's based on bad debt that's been inflated up beyond all reason, you can attempt to keep that artificial situation alive for as long as is feasible for these people to keep doing this. But if something is a bubble, by definition, there's an artificiality to it. So the idea is that what's artificial is not going to just become magically real if we just will it enough. So inevitably what's artificial will be shown to be artificial because the natural and the real will assert their reality over the unreality of the artificial. So there's an inevitable thing here where a bursting of a bubble, a collapse of a system must inevitably play out in some form. In the same way, like in California, if you If a dry brush naturally needs to burn every so often, then it naturally needs to burn every so often. And though we may say, I like to live there in that region, I would like to build a house there. So it's not necessary for nature to burn anymore because we humans, we're occupying this region now. So we'll take over, thank you. Nature is still going to say, no, I'm going to go ahead and burn. Like you can keep it artificially as you willed it to be for a certain amount of time, but what is artificial must inevitably succumb to nature. So this is what must inevitably happen for us in our global economic and financial system. And so this idea, this fantasy of a normality, going back to normal, I mean, technically we haven't been in normal for a very long time. I'm 35, my whole adult life has not been in normal because I joined the labor market in my early 20s during the period of this situation starting. And so my whole economic career has been in this bubble situation, and I knew it back then when I learned it because I lived in DC and I was in grad school studying business and economics and organizations and strategy, and I was learning all these things about the economy, and I was actually studying Michael Hudson back then because he was one of the few people who wrote that I could find. I'm sure there's many, but he was in Harper's Magazine. He wrote an article before the financial crash even happened saying that it would happen, and then it did happen. And all these people who were experts were saying nobody saw it happen. And I was saying, no, that's not true because I'm looking with my own eyes. I'm seeing the date on these documents, and they are saying what happened, what would happen with a financial bubble and a burst. And it did come true. So to say that nobody saw it and it was a big mistake was obviously a falsity. It was a not true statement. And so I decided I wasn't going to trust people who were saying things that weren't obviously true to me. I started looking more into people who were saying things that were truthful, and so here we are. He's saying that the current crisis requires a write-down, and fictitious price levels must give way to reality at some point. Like we were saying, what's artificial cannot be substituted for reality just because we might will it to be. He says, we have reached the end of an illusion, the illusion that bond and stock prices could be sustained indefinitely simply by financial engineering, without an economic base capable of producing enough surplus revenue to justify existing stock prices and bond prices. And sort of the unreality of the situation is that all the people who participate in this unreality have such an extreme amount of wealth concentrated into them by nature of the fact that they're participating in this bubble, but it's financially, it's driven by the financial system. And the sort of mainstream economy, like I worked in restaurants for a long time, and so people like that aren't really participating in the financial system directly. So we're in the sort of real economy, quote unquote, and that's become completely detached from the financial economy. So if you're participating in the Wall Street system and that sort of massive asset price inflation that Dr. Hudson's talking about, you are somebody who's reaping the rewards of this extraction that's happening to the rest of society. And everybody else in the rest of society who's not participating in that is just trying to navigate and stay alive because the money is being diverted and the resources and basically the life-giving energy of our society is being diverted from the body to this central sort of like parasite system. And the parasite system is really sucking the life out of our world in a quite literal way. And so he's kind of giving us now in this next sentence, I think the key theme, he says, so attractive was this bubble situation to all the people who participated in it. These unrealistic bond and stock levels that everybody who's participating in the market is still in the denial phase about what's happening. So people are trying to run and maximize their dollar-denominated wealth and assets, not realizing that the dollar system is inherently unstable and must be replaced by something else. So he says that this whole situation is merely postponing the inevitable adjustment to bring asset prices back in line with real economic capabilities. So he's saying we're just postponing the inevitable realization of that there is a reality, and to not participate in reality for such a long period of time is going to inevitably have consequences. And so the leadership of our not our country, because it's not really governed as a country, it's governed as a sort of international corporate conglomerate, and that group is just delaying the inevitable and or setting up a golden parachute for itself, which I think will fail. So he says, to continue on this theme, the Federal Reserve's long quantitative easing and support of the financial markets has provided the appearance of stability. This artificial life support has been viewed as saving banks and large companies and pension funds and state and local finance from insolvency. So that's the point of the bailouts, is that the brush would burn, so to speak, in terms of feeling the pain of wrongful action. That sort of karma would be coming forth, except for a sort of national security situation demands that this not happen, and that the stability be artificially produced. And but like he's pointing out, this is inevitably a losing battle against reality. And it's been supported by the Fed in our whole governance structure. But these illusory values cannot be sustained. So just by nature of the mathematics, by nature of the reality, the resource constraints and limitations, it is impossible for us to go back to normal. So we are in the denial stage. Our society is in denial. It's in illusion, and that illusion has been one of the instigators of this whole problem, because if people weren't in denial and weren't in illusion about the situation, there would be no justification for doing what we've done. And he's asked, so where is this supposed to end? The Fed could buy up all the bonds. So that's kind of what it's doing. With the bailouts, it assumes these assets. So it takes on all these assets as a way to prevent their prices from falling, as we were discussing, for national security reasons. So at an extreme, this business as usual scenario would lead to the Fed owning the junk bond market, the municipal bonds, and a large swath of the stock market. So that's interesting. This actually seems like the pretty classic move of finance capitalism, which is expand, contract, and consolidate. So in the boom time, you make credit easy and you boom it up, and then you withdraw the credit, so you contract, and then you consolidate, because all the people who become insolvent, you have their assets. It's important to remember that every time we hear about a depression, it depends on perspective. The majority of the people experience a depression, but there's always the yin and the yang situation where there will be some people who have their boom time during that depression, and those are the people who are consolidating. And so he points out that when you have this centralization happen, ultimately the opposite could take place from what it appears, because it seems like we're going into a realm of nonstop privatization. But he's saying because all these private entities are ultimately part of a fictitious system who's entirely controlled by the Fed and the sort of national security structure underlying that whole system, that with this level of concentration in debt, he writes that the Fed would then have a free hand to do kind of what it wants in terms of how it decides to resolve the situation. And his approach, which he's written out through a number of his books, is to re-embrace the concept of the Jubilee, which is the great debt write-off, which has a long history within human civilization going back thousands of years, and is a very important institutional innovation to prevent sort of social collapse in the state of a type of financial bubble like this. And in his history work, like if you read some of his books, in his historical work, he shows how these sort of boom and bust and consolidation cycles have driven human history for thousands of years in human civilization. And so there has been techniques and tactics developed since the time of like Hammurabi in terms of how to deal with these type of endemic social issues. So those are the main points I wanted to point out. The article does go on a bit more, and he gives a nice case study paralleling our current situation with the previous third world debt crisis and some of the ways that it was resolved back then. But my feeling is that one of the issues that Michael Hudson doesn't take into account is the whole concept that the national security state may be engineering this. To give my interpretation, I feel like this system is being engineered in a way to set up a new institutional governance regime built around the coming out of breakthrough energy. And so what we're seeing is this massive consolidation globally in advance of a new sort of post-nation state, post-corporation, post-scarcity and resource scarcity and limitation environment. So it's clear to me that at least since the late 1800s, there's been knowledge, since the time of Tesla, there's been knowledge of what a lot of people call breakthrough energy. It's really either science. It's the traditional understanding of alchemy. So there's just rediscovering alchemy, and either being the fifth element. And so it's sort of an alchemy-based model of science is what has been protected by all this facade of fake science through all these years. And this sort of trend of materialism is a mask that masks what's happening in terms of these underlying dynamics about breakthrough energy and the need to create a global governance system that can ensure the international security against the abuse of these kinds of technologies. So that doesn't mean I'm justifying what we are seeing, what we have seen happen by any of the sort of financial and corporate power players, because I think that that's a group that the inner recesses of the national security state, who is doing the sort of deep state or Mr. Global or secret space program group that I've tracked in my various documentaries. That group is playing hide and seek with this technology, with a sort of aristocratic new money class, which dominates much of our global international affairs, like the Rockefeller type situations. I don't believe that those people are the true powers, even though their name is on all the major places that have very significance in our world in terms of major corporations and sort of institutional shapers. But I think behind that group, and perhaps hidden from them to a large degree, is the breakthrough energy, but also the alchemy and all the spiritual realities that underpin that. That has always been in human society the highest caste is also the one that's least publicly, that's most veiled from the public awareness, because it's the sacerdotal caste. It's the religious, the true religious like priesthood of mankind, that is the custodian of the sacred esoteric knowledge. So the caste system has never changed since the beginning, even though we think we may live in a modern age that has overcome the structures of the sort of pre-Christian world. That's not at all true. The actual caste of humanity, the caste structure, is, and by caste I'm saying C-A-S-T-E, the caste, like the Indian caste system. The caste structure of mankind is one that is religious and spiritual, and at the innermost recesses is the small group of priesthood who oversee the sacred knowledge, and then the outermost caste is the public. So that's the esoteric-exoteric divide, and then there's gradations in between that. But I truly believe the archetype is playing out in the same way it always has, in which in a sort of dark age, the knowledge is hidden from the sort of caste that's underneath the highest level of priesthood, so the sort of aristocratic class or the warrior class. And in the good times, that serves the priesthood, and in the bad times, that caste or that class attempts to rule on its own. And when that happens, the priesthood goes sub rosa, and we have this sort of grail quest that's combined a pursuit of knowledge with a pursuit of power by this second tier caste, this warrior class or the aristocratic class. And so this new money, sort of Rockefeller Gates group that appears to control the world, clearly to me that is the aristocratic class who the true knowledge has been concealed from. And in my personal opinion, when we inevitably have the coming of the true alchemy, the true science, and the global civilization that is going to support that coming out, that all these other people are going to be exposed for what they are, which are a sort of like materialistic cult, which has gone way too far with things. So that's only my opinion. I hope you enjoyed the video. Just the main thing I wanted to really point out is that the idea that we can go back to normal is an impossibility from an economic standpoint. And we should also just consider the fact that we haven't really been in normal for a very long time. And there is no stability to this situation that we're in. So everybody who's just wishing that they could just get the jab, everybody gets the jab, we just kill this Rona thing and we're going back to, you know, our plans that we had before and all the things that we thought that we were going to be doing in that old paradigm. It's just not going to happen. It's literally an impossibility. And so, like he was saying, we're in the illusion stage. We are in the denial stage as a collective. And to me, it's that illusion and denial which is the source of all the shadow projection of the unvaxxed, anti-vaxxers and stuff like that. For me, all the people who are most obsessed with that concept are the ones who are most in denial or most in delusion about the reality of the social situation that we're actually in. So anyway, this is my perspective. I hope you enjoyed the video. I have another video I'm going to do as a part 2 of this, that I'm going to extract some of the clips I have from Michael Hudson, where he gives his whole paradigm or his whole teaching about the bubble economy and the underlying dynamics of it. I originally cut this together as part of my docuseries called The Deep State. So I'm going to extract that material and have that as a second clip. So that'll be coming after this. But thank you very much for watching, and stay tuned. Thank you very much.